Tuesday evening. I was hoping to do this with, uh, sorry, I'm getting weird pop ups on my screen. I was hoping to do this past weekend, but technological issues intervened. This is more or less a test for what I'm hoping to be a weekly podcast for politics for Seattle, uh, the nation, the world. And a lot's happened in the past 10 days or so. So I want to go over that. We will probably fall back on the standard format that we used for so many decades on Eat the Airwaves, for those of you who remember that, um, where we go, Seattle, nation, world. But this week, there was a lot of national politics. So I want to spend some time on that. We have the primary ballots that are going to get mailed out this week. So this coming weekend, and I'm hoping to do this every weekend in the future, uh, we will go over the primary ballot and my recommendations for that and who's who, since primaries in Washington state happen in the middle of the summer and sensible people are not paying attention. Fortunately, I'm not sensible. So you can be sensible if you want. Uh, so uh, let's start with a week ago Saturday. We had an assassination attempt on Donald Trump. It was actually a pretty near miss. And subsequently, we've had the head of the Secret Service resign. There were a lot of calls on the far right for her to resign and blaming her simply because she was a woman, which is ridiculous and kind of what you expect from Republicans these days. But she did, in fact, resign because, um, from what I understand, the problem with the shooter being able to climb up on that roof on an outbuilding just outside the what's called the hard perimeter of security, which meant that local law enforcement rather than the Secret Service had responsibility for it. We had we had most Secret Service agents were already in Milwaukee for the RNC, which we'll get to in a minute. But that meant that in Butler, Pennsylvania, they were short staffed. They were short agents, and so they had to farm out some of the issues to local law enforcement and rally audience members pointed out the guy on the roof with a uh, long gun rather, um, to local law enforcement. And one local cop did actually climb up on the roof and try to confront the gunman. The gunman turned around and pointed his long gun at the cop, and the cop clambered back down, and nothing further was done. There was apparently no communication between local law enforcement and Secret Service. Secret Service was not alerted to gunmen on that roof until literally shots rang out, in which case the snipers took him out um, pretty quickly after that, fortunately for Mr. Trump. But yeah, you wonder why there was no communication amongst law enforcement and who was coordinating that and what the interface was and all the rest of that. Um, as much as I dislike Donald Trump and folks who are familiar with my history in the Seattle area of having newspaper columns and radio shows and all the rest of that, are probably well aware, and not to mention folks who follow me on social media are well aware of what I think of Donald Trump. I think he's a menace to democracy and a menace to uh, basically the American way of life, to use a hoary phrase. Um, but be that as it may, he escaped with a close call, and I think, and we'll get to this in a little while. The subsequent developments and the candidacy of Kamala Harris probably means he's going to lose in November, and that's probably the best possible outcome, because I would much rather have him sulk into retirement as a grievance-filled loser, um, and discredited cult leader than a martyr. Because the problem with modern Republican Party is that Mr. Trump has sort of shown them the way. He's shown them that they don't have to uh, message with anything tethered remotely to reality. That being bigots and being uh, essentially a message filled with hate and despair and taking people's rights away. Um, that's a winning strategy with a certain portion of the American public and American voters who apparently really want fascism and really don't care too much for democracy and freedoms and all the rest of that nonsense. So, um, Mr. Trump survived. And yeah, let's talk about the Nuremberg rally that was held in Milwaukee last week. It was 4 days of basically the coronation of Trump, and Trump as risen on the third day, kind of mythological godlike figure. And there is explicitly a religious. I mean, there's a reason people refer to Trump's hold on the Republican Party as that of a cult, because it really does come with a religious kind of fervor. And as long as Joe Biden was his opponent in November, it meant that Trump was going to have an enormous advantage in terms of the enthusiasm of his base and therefore the likely turnout of his base. Not that many people were enthusiastic about Joe Biden, which I think is unfortunate because he did a surprisingly good job, in my view. Um, you look at his long track record in the Senate, where he was one of the most conservative Democrats. He never met a war he didn't like. He relentlessly grilled Anita Thomas in the Clarence Thomas hearing, Anita Hill rather, in the Clarence Thomas hearings there, and let Thomas's clear lack of qualifications for the Supreme Court off the hook. And, Thomas kind of skated through those hearings, which he famously characterized as a high-tech lynch mob, which was kind of offensive at the time. This is like 1991. So woke was not a thing then. But yeah, uh, Thomas was bad news then, and he's been the gift that keeps on giving to conservatives for a long time. So, um, uh, Biden's track record going into the presidency was not great in terms of what his own legislative priorities were and what his own foreign policy priorities were. But he he somewhat surprised me as commander in chief. He certainly has a lot to answer for in terms of his handling of the Gaza invasion, but he did a very good job of standing up to Russia on the Ukraine invasion, and repaired a lot of damage to the United States foreign relationships that were happened under the Trump world, and yeah, at the same time, he got the worst pandemic in American history under control pretty rapidly. Bear in mind that something like 1.2 million Americans died from COVID, and of those, about 600,000, a little about half, um, were directly attributable to the policies of Donald Trump and the example that he set for state Republican governments in terms of COVID denial, in terms of what morphed later into vaccine denial, the conspiracy theories that ran amok, not talking about where it came from, but talking about things like, well, COVID doesn't really exist. And, well, COVID was really only an issue for the Democrat cities, so we don't have to worry about it. Well, as it turns out, on a per capita basis, the red states had much worse death tolls from COVID because they didn't believe in masks. They didn't believe in social distancing. They didn't believe in doing anything particularly unless they really had to. And that probably was Donald Trump's greatest crime. I would put that even above January 6th because so many people died and died unnecessarily. Um, that was really tragic. But Joe Biden got the vaccines rolled out fairly quickly and fairly efficiently after he took office. He brought the pandemic under control. And now, COVID, as the epidemiologists were saying all along, has become something of a chronic uh, disease that's sort of in the mix. But we have much better treatment options. We have the vaccines that roll out more or less once a year with the new updates, similar to flu vaccines. Get yours. It's coming out probably in September, the new one. So if you're not up to date on your vaccines, do it because COVID can still be nasty. There's still such a thing as long COVID, which has a whole lot of health complications that you just don't want. And particularly if you are older, if you have underlying health conditions, you need to keep up on your vaccines. So that's the public health message for today. Anyway, um, so Biden did that. He did those things. He got an infrastructure bill passed after Infrastructure Week had become a punchline during the Trump presidency. But he got that through in the first 2 years of his administration when Democrats had a majority in both houses of Congress, so he could actually get things passed. And he got several other important pieces of legislation passed as well. He got something like $1.3 trillion COVID aid package passed. That was hugely important. And yes, there was inflation in the beginning of his presidency. That's not something presidents have a lot of control over, as any economist will tell you. But the main problem with the economy and the inflation in the first years of the Biden presidency was that the economy was recovering from COVID, not just nationally but globally, with supply chain interruptions and all the rest of it. This was a international problem. It wasn't just a U.S. problem. So you really can't lay that at the doorstep of Joe Biden. But in the last couple of years, job numbers have looked a lot better. Inflation is way down, and um, you see polls that say most Americans are pessimistic about the economy. Um, that's not surprising because the modern economy and Democrats as well as Republicans are to blame for this. Um, is really has morphed into an economy where, because of deregulation, because of international trade agreements, you have the American economy, something like 43% of GDP now is the banking sector, which is insane. That tells you where all the money is going. That tells you what's been going on with the stock market, which is not a reflection of ordinary investors. It's an infection. It's a reflection of um, uh, it's a reflection of institutional investors and big money. That's who wins at that casino, not ordinary middle class people. The middle class has been steadily disappearing in the United States pretty much ever since Reagan time. But you look at Bill Clinton and some of the bills that he passed in the 1990s, Telecommunications Act, most famously. Um, there was a lot of deregulation and there was a lot of uh, uh, big corporate welfare. And that has continued with fits and starts, but it's mostly continued. Certainly, it continued under Obama um, all the way up to the present day. Um, Maybe some of that will get rolled back. I think there are two major issues that either party could take huge advantage of if only they had the guts. It would be very popular with voters. One is uh, enforcing antitrust laws, enforcing laws against monopolies and duopolies. We've seen this repeatedly with pretty much every segment of the economy where there's two, three, maybe four corporations that dominate most of the market share. And the corporations keep eating each other and buying each other until there's just a handful of companies left, and they can pretty much set the prices among themselves. That would be a winner with many voters who are really tired of having to deal with big corporations in every aspect of their daily lives. The other one is the decriminalization of weed. We've been very fortunate in Washington State to be to have that legalized for the last decade plus, and guess what? The sky has not fallen in. It has not been a gateway drug to uh, hard opioid use. There's plenty of that going around anyway, but it's not because of weed. Um, and um, that is an issue also that cuts across party lines. It cuts across age demographics, and you saw Joe Biden, much to his credit, pardon over 2,000 federal convictions for weed possession, federal laws that we're talking about. Um, Much to his credit, that took a fair amount of courage, and particularly for a guy with a history of being a drug warrior like Joe. He was a prime sponsor of the 1996 crime bill, that one that had the famous disparity dispar- disparity in sentencing guidelines for crack possession and cocaine possession, uh, which cough racist. Um, so. Um, yeah. So Joe had a really reasonably good record as president, but clearly everyone could see in the debate in the end of June and in his public appearances and interviews since then, you could see that he was slipping. And we're getting a lot of reporting that he was slipping cognitively as well. Um, I mean, there was a report late last week that Barack Obama appeared with him at a fundraiser, and I think it was Los Angeles, um, earlier this year, and was alarmed at how "quote unquote" disoriented Mr. Biden seemed. That is not particularly encouraging for number one, whether he could have served a full another term, at the end of which he'd be 85 years old, or number two, whether he could even win in November. And given the existential threat that Mr. Trump poses to, um, what many of us consider American democracy itself, Trump has said repeatedly over the last couple of years that he wants to be a dictator, and the template for his presidency, known as Project 2025, lays that out in great detail, 920-page detail. Every single aspect of the federal government is looked at for, you know, who, what we would prevent the federal government from doing, what we would give the chief executive, namely this Christ-like figure called Donald Trump, the power to do. Um, and we already had the Supreme Court ruling late last month that the president can pretty much do whatever they want, that they are, in fact, above the law. And we saw Trump's favorite district court judge, Eileen Cannon in South Florida, rule a couple of weeks ago that the special counsel that was appointed by the Department of Justice to investigate January 6th, that was an illegitimate law, even though it's been upheld by the Supreme Court and a number of lower courts in the 30 years that it's been on the books. But that's what this Supreme Court is like. And people are looking at that Supreme Court and saying, this is an ideological Supreme Court. It has a supermajority of conservatives. It has three that were appointed, two under rather dubious circumstances by Mr. Trump. One, Brett Kavanaugh, who was credibly accused of sexual assault in his youth. Another, in what's her name? Amy Coney Barrett, who was rammed through in the final days before the election in 2020 by a Republican-controlled Senate. Final parting gift from Mitch McConnell. But we have we have a Supreme Court that is not accountable at all. Biden let it be known about 2 weeks ago that he would support reforms for the Supreme Court and ethics code for the Supreme Court and term limits. Those would be important and helpful, and I think more realistic reforms than expanding the Supreme Court, which is something a lot of people have been bandying about for the past couple of years. But enough on the Supreme Court. Let's get back to the Republican convention, um, which was most political conventions have have two purposes. They're 4-day infomercials for their particular party, and they announce the running mate of the presidential nominee. So, as an infomercial went, um, the Republican convention went swimmingly. It certainly was, for anybody who was paying attention to all 4 godforsaken days, was certainly instructive in terms of what Republican priorities are. Um, but you know, um, that probably turned off anybody who wasn't part of the base or part of the Trump cult already. So at the same time, Trump named as his running mate J.D. Vance, famous for having written Hillbilly Elegy, which was then made into a not very good movie with some big name actors and actresses starring a couple of years ago. Um, and really, that movie could have been anywhere. The idea that it was set in Appalachia, aside from the twang, you really couldn't tell it was Appalachia. It could have been anywhere. It could have been suburban anywhere with families that were struggling. In that sense, it was very descriptive. But then you wonder why, when when Mr. Vance was raised by his mother and his grandmother, why he's so deeply misogynistic. I'm not a psychologist. Wouldn't I wouldn't even try to guess. But Mr. Vance is a very smart, very ambitious, very articulate proponent of American fascism. And there's really no way to sugarcoat that. I mean, he supports he supports bans on reproductive health for women, with no exceptions for rape or incest whatsoever. Um, he, yeah, he's just a very, very reactionary kind of dude, and it certainly seems like that's something that was not true in the years before he ran for elected office, when he was just an ambitious Yale graduate who hung out in Silicon Valley with Peter Thiel and various other libertarian billionaires in the tech world. Um, he he's not particularly libertarian either, because he supports all kinds of government restrictions on people's abilities to live their daily lives in ways he doesn't approve of. Um, he totally wants to roll back, for instance, LGBTQ uh, rights and freedoms. Um, and, this is something that the modern Republican Party has in common, and the Supreme Court has in common, frankly. I'm very concerned that in coming years, they might try to roll back Griswold, which was the original Griswold v. Connecticut decision that made Roe v. Wade possible. In the early 60s, it made contraceptions possible. It basically codifies in the Constitution um, Americans' right to privacy. And that drives Republicans nuts, because that's what enabled women to get in the workforce. That's what enabled them to have agency over their own bodies. And yeah, Republicans would rather that be rolled back, um, probably to before they had the right to vote at minimum. And this goes on and on. But we saw this in the Republican Party, and we saw this in J.D. Vance, who's had less than 2 years in elected office. He's 39 years old. He's extremely inexperienced. As I say, he's very smart, very articulate, and very ambitious. And he was widely seen as having been anointed by Trump as Trump's successor once Trump's body inevitably, begins to fall out from old age. But old age wasn't the issue for Trump, at least not obviously until the last night of the convention when Trump got up to speak. And, the Republicans had been talking about, oh, in the wake of the assassination attempt and this great near martyrdom of Mr. Trump, we're going to talk all about unity because this is a time for Americans to come together. And that lasted about 20 minutes into Donald Trump's speech. Once he got finished recounting and in a reasonably moving way his experience of that assassination attempt, um, he basically fell back on his rambling stump speech. He gave up the teleprompter and just started rambling about all his grievances, all his bigotries, all of the various things that annoy Donald Trump. This is something that he has been, uh, saying in public in his rallies and his public appearances for the last couple of years as he's run for another term as president. But most people hadn't been paying attention. He had a much larger audience this time. And it reminded us just how bad the Trump years were, how chaotic they were, how capricious they were, how many scandals there were. And most of all, what a freaking narcissist the man is. And that putting a narcissist in the most powerful job in the world is not really a very good idea. So, um, it looked like in the course of that speech that Donald Trump is also getting old. He's losing some of his cognitive abilities too, as was Joe. So we had two old white guys facing off with very different priorities for sure, but both of whose bodies and judgments may be starting to fail them. Um, you look at the tapes of Donald Trump from, say, 10 years ago versus, or even, 5 years ago versus this past week in Milwaukee, and he did not look well. He is not as sharp. He is not as quick on his feet. And so, meanwhile, immediately after the Republican convention was over, that's past Friday, you started getting these waves of senior Democrats, apparently orchestrated by Speaker Emeritus Nancy Pelosi, but also Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, Senate Majority Leader, I should say, Mark Schumer, the Senate Leader in the House, Hakeem Jeffries, and Adam Schiff running for Senate in California, and a number of senior Democrats, Jamie Raskin in Maryland, very well respected Democrats coming out and saying that Biden should drop out. And you were getting reports that, major donors to the Democratic Party were putting their donations to the Biden campaign on hold. And in addition, you had the reporting, which I mentioned earlier, that we're getting leaks from the White House and from Democratic officials saying this is not new. This is something that's been going on for months, certainly since the first of the year, that Joe Biden is getting old. People age at different rates, and they have different symptoms of aging as their bodies and sometimes brains inevitably get tired and lose some of their prior capacity. And that unfortunately appears to be happening with Joe Biden. He certainly, he kept saying in his campaign after that disastrous debate at the end of June, I can do this job. I can do this job. Well, nobody's saying he can't do the job now. The question, because he's got plenty of staff people who can present him with options, and then really all he has to do is choose among the options. But the question is, can he do the job in 2027, 2028? And more to the point, he can't do the job at all if he can't win in November. And he wasn't, the internal polling that the Democrats had and that the congressional Democrats in particular had showed a disaster, that people were fleeing Biden in droves. Um, which is really scary if you consider the prospect of a president for life Trump, which is basically what he wants to do, apparently. I mean, I'm glad he's not passing it on to, family members the way often happens with dictators in some underdeveloped countries. But J.D. Vance is probably a worse option because he would be more competent. Anyway, um, so Biden surprised everybody, I think, by stepping down on Sunday, stepping out, I should say, from the race, not stepping down as president, but stepping out as the prospective nominee for the Democrats. And then he turned around about an hour later and endorsed Kamala Harris as vice president. And Ms. Harris hit the ground running. Um, the Democrats raised over $100 million in the first 24 hours, which is unprecedented, and no presidential campaign has done that ever. Not Trump, not anyone. Um, and I think her public appearances, Monday in Delaware and Tuesday in Wisconsin. They're variations on her stump speech, but they're very, very articulate, and they show that she's going to go off. She's going to go directly at Donald Trump, which is something I think the Democratic base has been just waiting for. It's like, hello, don't talk about don't talk about these intellectual concepts of saving democracy. Talk about something that we can understand. Talk about the indictments. Talk about the scandals. Talk about the the moral turpitude and the graft and all the rest of it. He's a con man. He's a grifter, and he's greedy as heck. And you know. That has been very welcome. And remember, she has a background as a prosecutor, which I think will actually serve her well. I mean, for some of us, it's not a gold star, but it is for people who are sort of the handful of people who are still undecided in this race, who don't really want Trump, didn't really want Biden either. Um, but they might be willing to consider somebody who um, has a background of fighting crime. And I'm sorry, but the memes of prosecutor versus felon are already all over the internet. And I'm really looking forward to seeing her debating Donald Trump. Trump says he wants to debate her, maybe multiple times, but he doesn't want ABC to host it, even though he previously agreed to have another debate hosted by ABC rather. He wants it to be hosted by Fox, which is, a propaganda arm of the Republican Party and has been since 1996. Um, be that as it may, those of us who remember Kamala Harris in the U.S. Senate, um, where she would grill various unfortunate figures in the Trump administration who came to the Senate to testify, and she just made them look really, really bad with a handful of pointed questions. And I think that she can um, make Donald Trump uncomfortable on the debate stage in a way that Joe Biden could not possibly have. Uh, the other piece of that is that uh, she's a woman, of course. She's a person of color. She's the daughter of immigrants. And all of those scream to Donald Trump that she is an inferior human being. You've already seen this in some of his posts on the media where he's going nuts over the prospect of a Harris candidacy. And I think he can't help himself. He is going to say some really impolitic things between now and November. And, it'll be fascinating to see that play out. The other thing that I'm concerned about between now and November, I do think that Harris has a very good chance of winning at this point. And, there's a lot of time between now and November. Most people don't really start paying attention until after Labor Day. We'll see how the Democratic convention goes in August. It's coming up in about 15 days, I think. Um, but, you know, A lot can happen between now and then, but Trump has already said he's not going to accept the result if it's not favorable to him, and he's already been cueing his less hinged supporters, shall we say, that violence will be an acceptable uh, option if if they don't get what they want in the ballot box in November. Um, this is what fascists do, and he already has one notorious incident uh, between November 2020 and January 6th, 2021, of his trying to overturn the results of a Democratic election that was fairly decided. Republicans have very quietly in state legislators since then been trying to suppress the vote, been trying to um, uh, take control of elections away from local election boards and hand it to Republican elected officials in the state legislature if they don't like the outcome, or if in their fantasy world somehow there was voter fraud, which has never been proven, which was thrown out in some lawsuits in 2020. Um, but they're going to allege the same thing, and they're going to try their best to suppress the vote, which I think having Harris at the top of the ticket, um, that will not be as successful because it just motivates people to jump the hurdles and turn out to vote anyway. But yeah, my concern is that there is a very high probability of violence if if Harris wins at the ballot box in November. Um, and with that cheerful thought, and speaking of ballot box, we have the Washington State primary elections coming up. Um, August 6th, I believe. And I'll vote by mail, of course. And the top two finishers go on to the general election in November. Mostly House, Senate, and state legislature and statewide offices are on the ballot this time in the Seattle area. And next weekend, I will be going through all of that. I'll have a few more bells and whistles. This is a little bare bones, I know, but we just moved into our new place, and we're just trying to get things up and running here. And I'm looking forward to doing this every week. I'm back in the saddle and really excited about it. And really excited to have you all join me. Uh, we're doing this as a YouTube channel. So we'll do it we'll do it with a live chat feature where I'll be able to answer questions as they scroll through the chat. And at the same time, we'll have some more bells and whistles. I'm setting up a Patreon account, so you can help support the cost of my having to host a channel and pay for the internet and keep the lights on and all the rest of that. Um, yeah, it's all good. And for Patreon subscribers, I'll be doing weekly written essays as well that I'll make available to uh, people who help pay to keep the lights on. I really appreciate your watching, and thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you next weekend. Thanks.